Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters, and Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years. Hi, and welcome to Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community. I'm Mary Kate Karpetras, and I'm standing here today with Luke Haynes. Hi, Luke.
Hey.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Luke is here today to show us how he uses a long arm machine. And this interview, or this tutorial, is going to be a little bit different than some of the other long arm lessons we've done or demonstrations we've done, because you use it in a more organic, free-flowing way, it sounds like. How long have you been long arming?
Gosh, I've been long arming for about 3 years.
Okay.
But I come to it from sort of a, what we'll call it a design background. So I do it a lot more like I'm drawing on top of a painting or a piece of paper than in the sort of more traditional technique coming from hand quilting and then moving into using a machine.
Templates, do they exist in your world?
No. I mean, I'm working on the quilt and with the quilt. So, I mean, that's where I get my sort of design inspiration from, is I try to create areas for myself to work within as I design the quilt.
And I'm looking at this, and this is not quilter's cotton.
No.
And that's very typical of your work, is garment weight fabric, and what other textiles do you use?
So my rule is the more the merrier. So I want to get a whole range of fabrics. I mean, in this particular one, there's velvets, there's wools, there's some stretchy lycra pants. I mean, there's this whole range of different things. There are some cotton, some sheets. These were some jammies. And so, what I get at the end is this really interesting sort of conversation of textures within the project that talks about all the things that we make our lives out of textile-wise.
And you've kind of always been working in that vein. So it's not like you came from a traditional heavily starched quilter's cotton background or something. So comparing how this fabric reacts on the long arm to quilter's cotton is maybe not something you have experience with. But can you talk about just how this variety of fabrics acts on? I mean, you got like an exposed seam here.
Yeah, I mean, there's just,
how does it react on the long arm machine?
I mean, it works well. I mean, I have to fight with it sometimes, and by fight with it, I mean just work around it and kind of hold it down and make sure that I trim the back really well so that it's still a really nice flat quilt top. But as it stretches, you can just kind of work with it as you're working with the machine. So you don't have to be so worried about it. I mean, the fabric really it wants to lie flat. So you just kind of let it, I guess.
Okay. And I was looking at this quilt that's behind us here beforehand, and I just a quick glance at it, I said, oh, it's improvisational. And you said, no, it's not improvisational. No. That those logs you cut them at 1 inch, so they're finishing at a half inch. But there's something about the way that the piecing goes together and then the quilting that creates more of an organic quality to it. And how much of that is achieved here at the long arm?
The real answer is everything is achieved with the long arm, right? That's the point at which the piece is finished, and you can see if you were successful up until that point. Do you know what I mean? And so a lot of it's done with the fabric, and it starts to settle, but at the long arm, you're able to kind of nudge it and hold it down. I kind of just let it sit as it goes, and so sometimes it'll twist or turn as the bias cut, comes into play or whatever, but you kind of don't know what that language will be until you've quilted it, until it's done, and you step back and say, oh, that's how it will be. You won't really get a sense of what it'll be. Okay. And you were saying you based your large quilts, but maybe not so a quilt this size behind you. Right, something larger than that.
You don't do a basting. Tell us about how you based your large quilts.
Sure. Well, I think based, I guess, in my case, is more of a based, because what I'll do is I'll come over the entire quilt with a monofilament, and I'll actually quilt it all down, often kind of stitch in the ditch to just hold it where it'll go, and then I'll come back on top of it and do my more precise line quilting and stitching and things, so that it'll all lay really flat, and so that the backing and the top stay right where I want them when I'm coming back and working in sort of the micro areas. I don't have to worry about the rest of the quilt.
Do you start in the center of the quilt? Do you start at
I start at the top and work down.
Okay. And the fabric still just manages to lay where you want it to.
Yeah, gosh, yeah. I mean, really the rule is start from one side and go to the other, and you'll be fine. If you start if you work towards the middle, you're going to have problems because you're going to kind of push everything together. If you start from the center and work out, that works out okay, except the long arm is difficult to do that. So for me, I use a long arm, and so I start from one side and just work towards the other.
And when you well, a lot of your work has this, a figure, a portrait on top of a traditional backing. What do you quilt first? Do you quilt well, I guess if you work from the top down, you're quilting it all, but do you tack the figure first and then do the back?
So a lot of these
background?
I'll actually have quilted the quilt and then put the figure on top of it second.
Aha.
So I'll quilt it twice.
Aha, okay.
So I quilt the quilt and then I put the figure on it. I find that if I try to quilt the whole thing together, an unquilted quilt top and then a figure, it's going to stretch funny and I'll get a little bit of, and you can see it because it's so much thicker where the applique is, and the quilt will start to kind of come in there. So I like to make the quilt kind of flat first and then put the figure on it.
And you were saying you like to change out your bobbin thread. And the reason for that is?
So I'll change the bobbin thread depending on what I'm quilting on the top so that the back becomes a contour drawing or a line drawing of what I've done on the front so that the back becomes interesting as well.
And then you use a different bobbin thread for the figure.
Yeah. So that it becomes, again, it's this, then when you flip it over, you can see where the figure is on the front. It's just a kind of drawing of what the work I've done with the fabric on the front.
Great. Well, let's sew.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me pop this over for you, and then I'm going to let you drive from here on out.
So the way that I like to do it, I think it's really important to start with your quilt in the machine, like really nice and tight. So I'll start, make sure that I go ahead and tack down my corner. Just like that, and then I'll make sure that everything is kind of how I want it. I can use registration lines from a number of different places. Either the machine here, I've got a really nice straight line, or sometimes the backing fabric will have a line there, so I can kind of gauge if I'm going straight, because this particular line is the most important line in the entire project, is having a really straight line at the top so that when you're pulling it, everything pulls straight. So now that I've started that tack, I can go forward. All right. So I've made myself a really nice line right there that I can kind of work from. And you can get really close to it, or I don't mind too much if it's a little squirrely because I'm going to trim the edges of it afterwards. And so then I'll come down and do that same thing on the sides. And I'm just holding it with my hand here, kind of smoothing it and pulling it so that I have a really nice, strong edge to work from. And I'm going to come back over the top. Just really holding everything down nice and tightly. And then come back. I mean, I find that, stopping and kind of smoothing it, because again, what we're doing right now is the most important part. We're making sure that it's stable for us to give ourselves a place to work within that's not going to bubble or pull or do anything that you don't want. Because you want to kind of do it on purpose, right? I mean, you want to hold it down. So I'm going to come down and fix this second side. And with this garment fabric, you do have to kind of work with it a little bit, and end up kind of massaging it and pushing it and pulling it, because there's still some wiggle room in there. But now that I've got my three sides tacked within my working area, I've got some places I can work. Now I don't have to worry about it pulling in any real way that's going to get in the way of what we want it to do. So I can start to work. And I put some white thread on here, and we're going to work within the black fabric, and you can really see how that starts to pull out some of the lines. And the way that I quilt is really just pulling from the geometry. I do mostly straight line quilting because I do mostly straight line piecing, and I feel like those languages make a lot of sense together, because if I start to put in some more organic lines to it, it's another language that I haven't put into the quilt itself. And so for me, I think it's really nice to keep common language for the project so that it all makes sense when you're viewing it as a final project at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start working in some of these straight lines and just really kind of following the fabric.
But it's still a free motion straight line.
It's still a free motion, and I'm following the quilt, and I'm following the lines of the piecing that I've done. And you can see my other hand right here is holding it down, and that's keeping it a little bit tight. And so when I let it go, then it kind of fluffs a little bit, and it starts to get a little bit of body in some of the areas. And and again, I'm just following along the piecing that I've already done. So I've kind of made the language in the quilt already, and all I'm doing now is reinforcing that language that I made when I designed the quilt. And what I'm using for a guide is the edge of the foot.
Okay.
So what I'm doing right here is I'm just following along the line with the edge of this foot that's around the needle. So that gives me a good 1/4 inch. So that's a really good a scale for me to work with. It's really easy. There are different feet that you can get that allow you to use, if you're using the feet for that, you can get kind of bigger or smaller. If you want it half that size, what I'll do is instead of doing it smaller to start with, I'll do it all over once and then come back and then just split the difference.
Okay.
And that just gives me guides to work within so that I'm not, going blind. So the templates are the project itself, you know what I mean? If that makes sense. So I'm not using rulers or guides or pantographs. I'm actually working with where the lines of my piecing are. And then the lines of the sewing machine and hoping those all work out.
So before you were doing all this on a domestic sewing machine, before
Yeah.
you got a long arm.
Well, I mean, before I had the long arm, I didn't do a whole lot of quilting. I would just follow around the edges with a satin stitch of the figural work because, again, it gave me that really great topography on the background of the front figural work, but it was something that was really manageable on a sit-down domestic machine. Whereas now that I have a long arm, I'm able to come in and get a lot more detailing while still maintaining control of the piece.
So even though the quilting that you're doing is, again, you're not using pantographs or doing really specific template work, it sounds like it's really opened up capabilities for you in terms of the type of what the end product looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I love using the long arm. It really gives me an ability to come in and work with a piece on any number of scales. Something this small is fine, but I could do a quilt. I've made a quilt that was 11 feet long by 9 feet wide, and I was able to get in there.
Which would be hard. It's hard to do on a domestic machine.
Right.
Not impossible, but difficult.
Yeah. And so for me, you'll see that there are some variations in my stitches. There's some waving that just happen organically through my own just sort of human error. And I find that to be really interesting
It's
because
the artist's hand at work.
I'm the person who made this, right? And I can get a machine that can do really straight, beautiful lines. But I'm not a machine, and so I really like the fact that you can see once you kind of choose to get up close and kind of investigate
Let's
my
move
work.
the machine. I'll let you cut the threads or whatever,
Well,
and we'll get the machine out of the way so that we can get a look at what you just did.
Yeah.
Okay. So like you said, it's not perfectly spaced lines,
Right.
but it's really beautiful, and it does add that great extra texture.
A super
to the quilt.
texture. Yeah. And it starts to pull. And so one of the things I like to do is leave some areas unquilted, and so that you get this really nice pop. And if I really want to get that kind of faux trapunto look, I'll add a second layer of batting ahead of time and heavily quilt some areas and leave some, and so that you'll get a really nice contrast between the two. So you can create these nice shadow lines between your stitching and then the other piecing.
Thank you for giving us this insight into your technique and your process. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take care. Bye-bye. Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters, and Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years.